It's not because I'm hiding behind the pound sign. It's because we are going to be discussing finance. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the Sutherland Report. The joys of speaking, pressing buttons, and trying to put everything technically together at the same time. One of the wonderful things about doing this is the people that you get to meet. You remember, if we go back during our election run up last year, we had an election in this country on the 4th of July. I was doing a series where I was interviewing a number of reform candidates. One of those was dear Ian Gribbin, and we have stayed in contact. Ian, Bexhill area, down south of this wonderful country of ours. And one of the wonderful things about connecting with people is that you get to know them, and then you suddenly find out that they have a lot of life experience in particular sectors that is very, very relevant and important. So Ian and I, the other day, we were having a conversation. We are both concerned about the financial position that our country is in. Ian has an extensive experience in finance, and I thought it would be a wonderful, wonderful conversation to bring on someone that has experience and to ask Ian a number of questions of where we are as a country. So I'm going to welcome my friend Ian Gribbin back.
Good morning, Mark.
Really good morning. Good morning.
We as you just mentioned, we had a quick chat on WhatsApp a week or so ago, and thought it might be an interesting time to discuss the economy and what's going on. As you've highlighted, I have an extensive experience in finance, and I've worked at insurance companies in the early part of my career. I've worked at the world's largest hedge fund for 5 years of my life. I worked as an investment banker and a proprietary trader, trading the bank's book in my career. And I ended off my career in Japan as managing director of a global finance company. My experience, and the one reason why we agreed to do this call, Mark, which I think would help the listeners and viewers to it, is the fact that my experience in Japan is enormously interesting given where Britain is at the moment, and the way that people, the Japanese economists, and indeed many of my friends in finance out in Japan think about things is very different from that we think of in the West. And in part, that's why I agreed to stand for reform, because I do bring a fresh perspective. As the talk goes on, we'll go into some of the similarities and some of the differences between Britain and the UK. But I found the orthodox explanation of where the country is through organisations like the IFS, the OBR, the Treasury, are not sufficient to explain where we are. And it worries me very greatly that we're going for solutions that are, either going to work very weakly in the short term, or over the long run not be sufficient enough to get the country out of the situation it's in. If I can draw, I know that one of the things I wanted to do in this chat was to be able to simplify things for ordinary people, and I hope I'll be able to do that this morning. But if I can draw a little metaphor really to where the country is at the moment, it's that if we were to represent the UK economy as a human body, and what successive governments have done is really only attend to the outward signs of disease, the mild effects of a disease like an eczema or some kind of skin rash, when what really needs to take place in the country is major organ surgery. And that's what I'd like to run through today. I know you've got a batch of questions to throw at me, and hopefully within those questions I can explain in a way that people will understand what our problems are, and then perhaps later on we can discuss what the potential ways of solving them are.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I sense that we might have to do part two. But Ian, I'm quite open with this, and it's very interesting when you're drawing your experience of working in Japan and the cultural differences of how people in the East and the West then view things. Would it be fair enough to say that they have more of a longer term view and a long term planning and looking at the long game, where we are just looking quarterly, half yearly to get to the next quarter? And of course that has an effect in how we view things. Where is the long-term investment?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of this conversation is going to be about investment, because this is what the country is missing. I don't have any charts in front of me at the moment, but if I were to show you a chart of investment in the UK compared to the rest of the G7, and not just for the last 5 years over the COVID period, but if I go back to the late 90s, and our investment has lagged by some substantial margin every other country in the G7. And part of the talk this morning will be discussing that. But to the point, in my experience of 25 years in Japan, there is a cultural difference between the way that the Japanese structure their economy, but also the way they think about developing their business over there. And they haven't had it all good either.
No.
You know, they've had a very, very rough time too. They had their credit crisis that was far worse than our own in the early 90s. But out of that 30-year mess, they've still managed to keep GDP per capita up, whereas, as we all know, GDP per capita in the UK has fallen every year since our own credit crisis. So we're not doing something right, Mark. And that's what I would like to sort of go into bit by bit. But to your point, culture matters. Culture matters for economics. People like to think that a lot of economists who are very self-reverential, they like to think that they hold the keys to all wisdom. But as I'm going to demonstrate as we go forward with this, is that culture dictates the economics. Economics is downstream of culture. What people think is very important to how economics is developed and implemented. And that's a very important point that people should recognize. We're all responsible for the type of economics that we pursue.
No, brilliant. So I suppose the first good question is to say, other than the fact that we know where we are, I'm in the studio, you're at home. So where are we economically as a nation in your view? And you've begun to explain some of that. And what does this whole debate about guilt, what does this mean to the ordinary person in the streets? I suppose that then goes into the whole thing of the yields and the whole aspects of how the whole yield market. So start us off. Where are we? What does the guilds mean? The whole debate about that, and what effect, as the Americans say, does it have on the man in Main Street?
Yeah, so that's a good starting point for us. So, as viewers will know, there's been a lot of worry in the press recently about the movement up in interest rates that has been caused by Rachel Reeves's budget last October. The reason for that is worries over growth in the economy and to some degree worries of inflation. Let me explain that about how the gilt market actually operates. So the government borrows money, and to do that, they issue bonds, which we in this country call gilts. And the market effectively prices those, what price it pays for them. So if the market is worried that the government is going to issue more debt to pay for its spending, then it demands a higher rate for that, particularly if it's unexpected. And what fell out of the budget was some unexpected spending. There was a gap, and the market seized upon that very quickly. So what has happened since then is that the yield on very long-term money. So if the government wants to, usually when the government issues debt, it issues it across a spectrum of what we call maturities. So it can issue debt over 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and then 1 year, 2 years, 3, 4, 5 years, and then 10 years and 20 years. And that depends. The way that's done is the Treasury issues that debt, and it makes decisions depending on where the spending is due, whether a certain percentage should be done at, say, a 10-year time horizon or a 20-year time horizon. So it issues it across all these years, depending on what its objectives actually are. And the market is worried at the moment because what they see is a gap opening up between what's been spending and what's coming in taxationally. So what that means for ordinary people, when the longer term interest rate is increasing, as it has done over recent weeks and months, it means that mortgages, business loans, and a number of other assets are then priced along that curve. So it puts pressure on businesses because their interest rates go up on loans, and bringing out new loans is more expensive than replacing the old loan. From the mortgage holder's point of view, it's obviously going to make his mortgage more expensive. That has a feedback loop into the economy, because if your mortgage is going up, then you're not likely to spend as much money. So it has an effect on the consumer, and on the business level, it has an effect on their ability to invest. The problem with what's happened at the moment is that Reeves has made her forecast based on a certain amount of growth. And one of the reasons why it didn't happen, this move didn't happen in immediate aftermath of the statement, was because we didn't yet have growth data in at that point. And so what has happened is we've had 2 quarters of zero growth. And this has started to get the market worried because the economists model how much tax is going to come in from the growth rate. So if the economy is growing fast, the Treasury is expecting more tax to come in. And that hasn't happened. We had the number out yesterday for our growth for the December quarter, for the November month of November, and that was just 0.1% as well. So the growth isn't there, and therefore people who used to work in my industry, economists, will be looking at their little models and saying there's no growth, and so the tax is going to be this much lower than we expected, and therefore, and the spending remains the same, but the tax is lower. So there's a gap opening up between the tax that we're taking and the money that we're spending, which has an effect on those people that buy our gilts. Right. If they see that gap opening up, then they start to worry and say, hey, hang on a minute, I'm not going to buy this much government debt because there's going to be more coming out 3 to 6 months down the line. And that's the place that we've got ourselves into. I hope that sort of goes through how the gilt market works in a rudimentary. There's a lot more to it than that, as you can imagine, but that's basically the predicament the country finds itself in. And if I can just maybe contrast that with what's going on in other places around the world, which is important too, because some of the commentary that I've seen on the TV recently misses a bit of a trick. So, for example, in America, they've experienced the same thing with their bond market, which is called the Treasury market over there. They've seen rising long-term interest rates as well. Their predicament is very different because America has had incredibly strong growth in the last couple of years after coming out of COVID. There's a reason for that, and that's because the Biden administration spent like drunken sailors.
Yes.
And they've got a different kind of problem. They've actually got a bigger deficit than we have, but they have a nicer problem to solve because they've got the growth there. We've got a horrible problem to solve because we've got no growth, and we've got high spending that's going to continue going unless Reeves decides to hold some kind of emergency budget in the next month or two. The other thing I'd like to add is something that's very important about not just the Rachel Reeves, but economics generally. And I'm not a trained, I should add, I'm not a fully trained economist. I'm spent my life reading economics books. My brother is, and we have a lot of economic debates together. It's quite funny. He said, why didn't I do that in my university degree? And so I'm coming from a different sort of background to he, which is why I think in an unorthodox way about where we are. So going back to the point about credibility, it's very important for the markets to feel like they have somebody in their treasury or certainly the Chancellor of the Exchequer's position that understands them. Nigel Farage gave a really wonderful speech back in 2009 that unmasked all of this ignorance when he said to the European Union, back in early 2009 when everything was falling apart, he said to the group, he said, I've just come in and I looked at my newspaper this morning and it seems that bond yields in Greece are now 0.5% higher than bond yields in Germany. And he said, now I know most of you won't have a clue what I'm talking about or what it means, but this is a very, very bad omen.
Yes.
And unless you pay attention, gentlemen, the markets are going to pay attention to you. You can claim ignorance now, but the markets won't forget you. And it was, I was in my office at the time and some of my staff were watching it. We all cheered about this because he hit on a very, very important point, which leads us back to Rachel Reeves. And that is that the market doesn't trust Reeves. The market, and by dint of that, they don't trust the Treasury either. And they don't trust the OBR because all these people signed off on what she was trying to do and said that this 22 billion black hole was for real. And so part of the move in gilts is a level, not just of where we are with the economic numbers, but it's where we are in terms of the trust between the market and between our financial gurus in Downing Street. So that's important to note. So the economy faces a rather tough time, going back to our original point, is that consumer spending is likely to be crimped. Business is not going to be doing a whole lot of investment. I hope that sort of covers the point that we set out.
It does. And can I just interject here and say, when you use the word trust, should it then equal confidence that can
Correct.
then increase that trust? Because within our news cycles at the moment, there is that constant word of confidence that the markets then refer to. Right. So let's look at, when you're talking about the OBR, we're talking about the Bank of England. So let's go to Rachel Reeves. I think you've begun to understand, you've begun to explain this, but because there is this, so they'll then be looking at their planning. This is what we're doing. Confidence begins to go through the floor. And then as we're finding out where companies are saying, well, we are now, because of national insurance hikes, for one, we are now not going to take on more staff. I'll just break it down in the way I see it in that sense.
Please do.
And I think the other wonderful thing, where you're making a reference to your brother there, say you're not a trained economist, but you are someone like me that is fascinated by history, and I know that you are. I think you're quite a bit of a historian, and in being a bit of a historian means that you're looking back at cycles and where we've been at as a nation, and then you're then comparing it to other nations and what's going on. So if we then are in a position where companies are saying we're not going to hire other employees, we're not going to expand. In fact, we're going to have to just stagnate. We're not going to grow at all. I think part of our discussion would be this whole thing of, which is something that's very close to me. Where is manufacturing? We need to be making things? We need to make the goods so we can export them. You've made the brilliant point about America, because they are the currency of the world, the world currency. Bretton Woods is another very interesting discussion on all of that. So Rachel from accounts, and I will use that. I will use that because this describes then the disparity. This begins to undermine, by saying that it says how the lack of confidence people feel in their ability. Ian, this may be a bit of a side sort of avenue, but why don't they trust Rachel Reeves, and what does that mean to the markets? You've begun to explain that. But where does this whole thing of Liz Truss, the accusation of not explaining things to the OBR, where Liz Truss wanted to, corporation tax, let's lower that. We want to low taxes. I'm saying this in my sort of limit, in a sense of limited understanding. But if you lower taxes, then in the end, that builds confidence. People will go out into the market and go out in life and spend more, go to restaurants, put money into the economy. It's a bit of a long-winded thing, but this government have constantly, and we know within the left-wing media, have constantly had a go at Liz Truss. What's interesting is that Liz Truss has sent a cease and desist letter, to the Starmer government to say stop blaming her for the economic hole. Labour keep going on about this 22 billion. They've spent a lot of money giving public sector pay rises to nurses, people in the health service, and trains. That's a big question. Would it help you to compare the two?
Yeah,
Reeves, Truss.
Yeah, let me just go through that point. So I really admire Liz Truss, actually. I think she had it exactly right. Going back to your points on history, that shows that if you have a debt problem, and viewers will be aware that the UK now has 100% of debt to GDP, which is up to wartime kind of levels.
Yes.
So the markets are already a little bit on tenterhooks around that. What happened to? Sorry, let me contextualize. So to get out of those types of problems where you have very high levels of debt to GDP, you have to go for growth. You have to do, even if it means in the short term you're borrowing more money from the markets to fund that. So the initial round of tax cuts will crimp Treasury revenue in the initial phases. But what then unfolds, if that is if people persist with that, the growth rate picks up. So in the short term, they go down. In the long term, the amount of tax revenue will go up. And, this is what we've seen in the United States. I mean, I dislike the Biden administration, but the amount of fiscal spending that they threw in was enormous. And the result of that is they've got super strong growth. We've probably got to go back before the credit crisis to see the kind of consistent growth that they've had over there. So they've had that fiscal uplift, if you like. But the way that you get yourself out of those debt situations, and then why Trump's new Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said yesterday that he didn't want to reverse the Trump tax cuts because it would upset the markets. Well, he's dead right.
Yeah.
You've got to leave that in place. And while growth is strong, the markets will tolerate that as long as they're getting the growth coming through. It's what the primary driver for the gilt market and for treasury markets, various governments around the world, is that they're looking for growth. That's the important factor. Secondary to that is the second most important thing. They're looking for low inflation too, that doesn't erode the value of that. And so in a nice way, the US is in a pretty good situation. It's got inflation falling and it still has a pretty high growth rate. So they are despite their deficits, they're in a pretty good place. If we come back to the UK, then we're not in such a good place. You brought the term up, I think you mentioned stagflation or stagnation, and that's certainly where, what we're staring down the face of right now. So let's move a little bit back towards what happened to poor Liz Truss. So she was trying to do the similar thing to what's gone on in the United States. She was going all out for growth. She wanted to cut taxes, and she thought she could get away with leaving spending as it is and just cutting taxes, which, yes, would have created this gap very, very short term between, while the economy got growing again, between what we were spending and what was coming in through in terms of tax revenue. And the markets had a very bad day that day that she released all of this, not least because they didn't communicate a lot of what they were trying to do directly to the Treasury and the OBR. I'll just maybe spend a second on that. The OBR is an organization that was really created by George Osborne to justify all of the austerity measures that he put in place, which was a catastrophic error. I can't begin to explain to people here, when interest rates fall to zero, which is where they were heading in 2010.
Yes.
That means, Mr. Keynes, the famous economist, had pointed this out in the 1930s, is that, when there's a lack of private sector confidence and there's no, the banks aren't ready to lend money because they're worried about protecting themselves and their balance sheets, there's this enormous gap. And the only sector of society that can cover that gap is the government.
Yes.
But George Osborne, led by the OBR and orthodox economic thinking, decided to push the austerity button. And that made the economy worse. Business confidence was at lows. And there you have the government making it even worse. So many of our problems go back to the credit crisis and to Osborne and our establishment's view on what should be done at that time. It was a disaster. I mean, if we look at where we are now, where the government is having to borrow at anything from 4 to 5% to replace our roads, our potholes, to upgrade all parts of our infrastructure, from ports to the railways. It could all have been done at zero cost with zero interest rates under Osborne. But instead, that's where he cut part of the budget, and why we see the dilapidated infrastructure, 14, 15 years on from that time. So I really wanted to make that point, because a lot of us got duped into the idea that, we've got to tighten our belts because the banks are collapsing, and that was the wrong way to look at it. And we should have known from history that was completely the wrong.
Would you say that at that time we should have let certain banks collapse?
I certainly think that, Japan I experienced the situation in Japan 20 years sooner, and I don't think it would have been a good idea to have allowed the banks collapse. But what happened was that they recapitalized them. They injected public money into these entities, and there was some management shift, and there was some mergers of the banks into wider conglomerates, such as Lloyd's Group, now taking on what is HBOS after the credit crisis, and the Royal Bank of Scotland that got itself into a mess. So we did learn something, because the situation had happened, remember, 100 years before, during the great the Wall Street collapse in 1929. And the biggest mistake that was made back then was that they let the banks go to the wall. So in 1930, 4,000 US banks collapsed, and the effect that had on the economy and businesses not being able to get loans and their cash flows was a disaster and led directly to the Great Depression of the following couple of years or so. So we, in many ways, we went about it in that part of it, banks being injected with money. We went about it in the right kind of way. We also did the right thing as well by getting the Bank of England to print money and flood the system with cash. My main argument is that process went on for far too long. I mean, it really never, this what's called the QE process, it never really ended in 2019. I think people forget that the Bank of England was printing money like there was no tomorrow, for over a decade. And that's the bit that I dislike as well, because that's had we can get into that later, an unfortunate effect on house prices and asset prices. But going back to our Liz, who I've recent interviews with her. I mean, she's really been learning her stuff out since she was deposed from office. What shouldn't have happened was, so she released her budget, which was a good one in my opinion. It was all out for growth, but the market spat the dummy on it, and the reason for that was because the OBR and Treasury grumbled about it because they'd been bypassed, and the markets, like it when our institutions are all in agreement with one another and there's a consistent face put forward by the authorities. So to have that little disagreement there was enough in and of itself. Now, where Liz was undermined was the fact that our pension funds had been encouraged by the Bank of England's regulator, called the pension regulator, to borrow money to buy government bonds. It was a good way for them to keep spending or the expenses they were paying on debt down. And what they didn't realize was the extent to which our pension funds had borrowed money to buy gilts. And this was the whole reason Truss was unseated. The pension regulator had, since 2010, encouraged our pension funds to borrow this money. And yet, when it came to this moment of crisis, they had no idea how much money had been borrowed to fill this gap. And that's what's wrong. We're nearly 2 decades after the credit crisis, and for a regulator to actually say that they had, after encouraging the pension funds to do these things, to have no idea how much money had been stuffed in on that basis, that's absolutely criminal. I mean, at the very least, the head of the pension regulator should have been fired. Nobody knows his name. I do, but nobody knows his name, and the 6 members of the board that surround him. I mean, to be frank with you, none of them have market experience. They're all, ex-chartered accountants who don't really have much of a clue what's going on. And certainly, there should have been major questions asked of Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England about his supervision of the pension regulator. Absolutely shocking. And so I think if Liz had her time again, I think she would probably argue that the Bank of England should have been called in and hauled over the coals over their lack of ability to see what was going on. As a consequence of that, the markets went into a period of turmoil. Sterling got hit very badly in that process, and it took a change of government and a month or two to get over that period. But what Liz was trying to do, in essence, go for growth, was the right course of action. But our institutions resisted that particular path, and that's what bothers me the most. Is if we have anybody who decides to go all out for growth like that, how far are they going to succeed when you have institutional resistance like that at the Bank of England?
Absolutely. And you've mentioned the name Bailey, who was in charge of the Bank of England, and I'm trying not to be too sarcastic, but I'm wondering what real experience in the real world has Bailey had in regard? He's now the head of the Bank of England. What experiences he had in the real world? I don't see much if we look at his CV. So, you know what, Ian,
Yeah,
we're discussing. Sorry, go on.
I don't know. I read where you're coming from with that. The credentials of some of these people are not good. I mean, I've questioned the credentials of many people who've come into the policy committee called the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England. You know, many of them are academics. Many of them have not actually been in, you know, at the sharp end of finance, seeing how it all glues together. That's not to say they don't have some people who understand the markets. You know, I've got a lot of respect for Mervyn King, actually, who was the head of the Bank of England. He subsequently has repented and has written, you know, a couple of books since then, you know, looking at the problems with the Bank of England. And I interrupted you because I wanted to actually delve a little bit on this Bank of England subject, because one of the problems that we have is that the Bank of England's mandate is to focus on keeping CPI or RPI as stable as possible. They've got a rule, like a lot of central banks, that they must keep in consumer inflation within this 2% or so kind of range. Now, where I have major disagreement with this, and where my unorthodoxy, if you like, comes into play, is that I question whether the Bank of England is actually able, or has ever been able, quite frankly, to control consumer price inflation, which it is its number one goal.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a number of reasons for that. First of all, Britain is a country that is very dependent from overseas exports, particularly on food, for example. You know, we're only sufficient in about, I think, 40% sufficiency rate in our own food. So a lot has to be imported from overseas. We're also part of a big global trading network where we've run deficits in goods trade for the last 32 years. That means that aside from helping to determine the value of sterling, so if sterling's strong, that means we can afford more goods and products from overseas. It means they're cheaper. So that's the only mechanism really that the Bank of England has to control the consumer prices that are going on in the country, because so much comes from overseas. Some people will argue, well, if the Bank of England puts interest rates up and therefore takes away spending power from people, that reduces demand and therefore prices will fall. Some people make that argument, but again, with the world trading market in goods and a surplus of goods everywhere, that doesn't really hold water either. Right. So let's just say it's contentious that the Bank of England can control consumer prices. And it's perfectly obvious to me, and it should be to anybody else, is what they do control and what policy does have a great effect on is asset prices, particularly property prices. So as we saw from when they began their QE period, once prices had leveled out and there was a bit more confidence in the system a few years on, UK house prices once again began rising. And then they went through this crazy period when COVID began and printed another, I think, 400, 500 billion during that period, ostensibly to try and help small business. But what happened was absolutely extraordinary. House prices during COVID from 2021 through to the beginning of 2023, they went up faster than they did in the credit crisis.
Yeah.
And that's on an economy that had negative growth. And yet asset prices went up. And to me, that was a reminder that the Bank of England's policies have more effect on house prices and other asset prices than they do on consumer prices. So that's terrible, because what happens if you have high asset prices in a country? It causes huge deformations in the economy. So, you know, we all know that young people find it difficult to get on the housing ladder, for starters. They have to pay a lot more in rents than they should be doing. I'll give you a number out of that. So if we turn back the clock back to 1992, the early 90s, households were paying about 25 to 26% of their net income was going on housing costs. That's either mortgages or their rents. If we fast forward to today, that number is close to 60% now, 56% it was last year, which is huge. And the Bank of England is really responsible for that. Yes, we've got a lot of immigrants coming into the country, and that's created a bad supply-demand situation. But there's no reason, for example, why you still can't have the bad supply-demand situation and prices could be 50% lower than where they are today. And that's a millstone around the economy, because obviously if people are spending more on their, half their income on rent, they're not going to go out to a nice restaurant or, spend too much in the shops. Neither is business going to feel like expanding too much when industrial space, lease space, or retail space is as expensive as it is. And in fact, the worst part of it all is that it does actually feed through to inflation as well, because as you can imagine, if a business has to pay more per square foot to run its business from, or it's going to have to charge higher prices for its products. So it actually has an inflationary effect as well. So the whole way that the central banking system has been run and conceived over the last, particularly the last 30 or more years, needs a complete rethink. And that's the unorthodox part of how I think about things. And a lot of that, what I've just told you, is informed by the Japanese experience as well. Their property prices after their credit crisis, they went down over a 10, 12-year period. I mean, it was devastating to some people, but their property prices, their Tokyo property prices, for example, fell 85%.
Wow.
But the upside to that is that they've managed their way through that period. And the rents in Japan now are much more normalized. That gives people, much more freedom. Even small things like moving around the country to where the jobs are. If you want to come and work in London from, say, Newcastle upon Tyne or Gateshead, somewhere like that, you've got a big decision to make, because your rent is going to be 4 or 5 times higher than what it was up there. And so you've got this decision to make: can I earn more money and have more disposable income in Newcastle and Gateshead, or be in London and have my real income crushed? So this is a debate that we need. I'm not saying I have all of the answers there, but we certainly need to be talking about what the central bank needs to be doing and how that's got to change. One, I know I'm going on about this point at some length, but I think it's very important that people understand the necessity for that debate to happen.
Well, but I would. I'm just going to quickly leap in here, and the reason why I'm smiling is because you're using that phrase, the central bank, and the whole creation of the Federal Reserve and how that came about, and an interesting book called "The Creature from Jekyll Island," and explaining the formation of that. And before everyone switches off and goes, "You're a conspiracy theorist," these things are very, very important in regard to central bank control and what it does to the fluctuation, etc. It's a huge rabbit hole that I would encourage a lot of people to go down and look at. And then, I mean, Ian, we're going to have to do part 2. We're nearly 45 minutes in, which is incredible. I think we should, because you spark off with what you're saying, I'm then able to steer us down, I think, some important stops that are very important. So when we talk about Bailey, when we're talking about Bank of England, we end up having to go back to Gordon Brown,
Yeah.
and we then have to discuss the fact that he then said to the Bank of England, you've got autonomy, you will now be responsible for setting interest rates. And I'll just say this from a layman point of view, but being affected by that, and like many other people in this wonderful country of ours, it's all very well, these people in these nice offices within the establishment, within London, within the square mile, and as you referred to, the chartered accountants, making decisions, but they are making decisions that are affecting people, real lives on the ground. And as you quite rightly said, in regard to house prices, look at that differentiation in the 90s, 25% to nearly 60%. And then if people are trying to have families, they're trying to put food on the table, we're breaking this down into the real issues of how this
let me just interject on that point, because one of the interesting things is about the way that the Bank of England looks at inflation is it's very London centric. So we all know that inflation, went up to, 8, I think at one month was 9% at one point during this period after COVID. But if you actually looked at the way that was broken down regionally, so for example, London was trending at about 10 or 11%. But if you went to other parts of the country, North Wales, parts of the Northeast, where the economy is good, inflation was only at 3 or 4. So you've got this problem, not only on a national basis, but regionally as well, where the Bank of England is looking really just at London and not looking at what's going on in other parts of the country. So setting interest rates high was not what you wanted in Tyneside or Middlesbrough or North Yorkshire. It's a very, very London-centric thing, which is another problem that the country really faces, is this London centricity over things, and that's has had problems with investment in the north of England, for example.
Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to make that.
No. I think you're making a really, really important point, and I hadn't thought of that. I didn't know that, to be honest, in the way that works out. And what you're saying is really, really important, because there is this London centricity within our nation, and the effect of that in regard to the north, etc. Investment. We need jobs. I think you're raising a very, very important point. What, in the last 5 minutes then, and we are going to have to do part 2, and I even sense part 3.
I hope it's been interesting for you to, you've been able to follow along a little bit.
Ian, definitely, because I'm interested, from a layman's point of view, I'm interested in economics. I've been, we're of an age where we've seen certain cycles. If we go back to, say, the oil crisis of 1972, 73, and we see suddenly house prices accelerate, and then why? We have then gone through the Callaghan government. We then remember there's rubbish left in the streets, etc. Fight with unions. We then go through the Thatcher period. We know unemployment went up, and then things began to turn. History, that whole thing of, this is really. It is really, really important. And I come back to that, where people are discussing things in a nice sort of oak paneled room to say, this is what we're going to do. But it's how it has effect on people's lives. And of course, and I think another interesting subject, and we may not, and we've got to do this on another occasion, is this whole thing of energy. And we remember the miners' strikes, the etc., and what was going on there politically and historically. But you and I would both agree that for an economy to then grow, we need low energy prices.
Yeah,
We need
let
energy to go through the floor, and we
mm,
have
mm,
coal assets, we have gas assets,
mm,
we
mm.
have oil assets,
Yeah.
and that I know that's another subject. But I just
Well,
want to
we can spend just
sorry,
maybe, I know we've got, the clock's ticking.
yeah,
Um, the I think we were going to discuss when we talked about, what I would do at the moment, and let's just I can finish that off with
mm,
what you're saying on energy. Look, I advised a lot of companies in Asia about where they would invest, whether they said, are they going to set up a new factory in Japan or are they going to set it up in Malaysia? And I can tell you that when people do the feasibility studies, they will look at the country. Let's look at the UK. We've got the highest energy costs in the world,
yes,
an intermittent energy system. AI is enormously consumes enormous amount of power. Am I going to look to build, my European AI center in the UK, or am I going to do it in France, where energy is a fifth of the cost? Of course, I'm not. And then to go back to what's happened to our asset prices in this country. My cost of industrial leases here is 3 times that of what is in France. Where am I going to put my AI center again? I'm going to put it in France. I'll leave you, with a little metaphor. Is the way that I like to look at, to think about the economy. Is it's a bit like a garden, and you've got all different sort of plants growing in this garden. But if the soil isn't maintained and the fertilizer isn't applied at regular intervals, that's the government's job, to make sure that we've got these conditions, and then these little plants will be able to grow. And occasionally you'll get a weed in the garden that needs pulling out, and that's the regulator's job to do that. But right now, our little garden that we've created in England is dying. The soil's terrible, and nobody wants to put any plants in the country. So I might maybe hope that metaphor, can help people think a little bit about what we've said.
I think that metaphor is very important, and I remember the Michael Douglas famous film, during the 80s, early 90s, and I think one phrase, greed is good, but the whole thing of asset stripping. The people we see certain people, I'm not going to name certain names, but we see certain people floating around that suddenly end up opposite the mahogany table, opposite Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. And I'm then concerned about their asset stripping mindset, and seeing our country as a way to, right, well, we'll put a bunch of farmers out of business, and then we're going to go for their land, etc., etc. Now, before people call us conspiracy theorists and say, what are you going on about? We've got to face these. There's some very, very, very serious things going on, and we've got to face them.
Again, it's going to. I hope we've got a minute. Going on to this asset strip idea that, and it's certainly been the case that a lot of American private equity vehicles and domestic private equity vehicles have come in to take over British businesses. I'm not wholly in agreement with that. I think in certain circumstances it can work very well. But in a lot of circumstances, the reason is that money, and this goes back to our argument, money has been too cheap. When you're printing that much money, one thing we should just mention is, despite the level of government debt out there, there is actually a flip side to this huge debt coin that we've run up over the last couple of decades. And that is that to counterbalance that, there is an enormous glut of savings as well. And again, this never gets talked about in the financial press whatsoever. Half the world's population is over the age of 50 now. And that means that everybody has a propensity, a tendency to want to save money. I mean, if you look at China, for example, they've got a huge problem. 500 million people, are approaching retirement age. And so they're all looking for a return on their money to be able to cope through their pension years. And this is one of the reasons why money has been kept very cheap is because all this money is looking for some place to invest, and that money, when the United States retires, has been fired for the last 15 years in particular into private equity vehicles, who then in turn are looking for any business that they could restructure and draw a bit more juice out of to make their returns. So we've got a bigger, the private equity thing. I hear what you're saying, and not all of it is good for sure, but it is just part of a much wider problem and debate that the country and the world, quite frankly, needs to be talking about.
Well, Ian, I'm gonna have to play us out in a minute, but the wonderful thing is that we do need to have this discussion and explaining this, because another huge rabbit hole is actually what condition is the Chinese economy in, and if it is in which is not good, and if it is in that particular position, then what things will it actually, what will the regime do to cover that up, etc., etc., and that has some very, very negative connotations and especially as we have just seen Rachel from accounts, along with Mr. Bailey, go and have a go cap in hand to China. Ian, I'm going to play us out, and I just want to say this to you.
Mark.
It's been amazing. We're going to have to do part 2, and in many ways, as there are one or two other people that we listen to, I think explaining economics, simplifying that, not undermining the importance of it, I think is really, really important, because you and I would agree that we have had a couple of generations of people thinking, say from the Blair years, that maybe some certain people have, it's been very difficult for them, it's been painful, and we can see a lot of pain that's coming down the track, and how we prepare people for that, and what can we do. Ian, I'm going to play us out. I want you to come back. I want us to do this again, because I think these discussions are absolutely vital. So everyone, thank you for enjoying this conversation, because it's really important. Ian, thank you so much indeed.
Thanks, Mark. Great chat this morning. Thanks very much for hosting me.
All
the best.
Bless.
Cheers, Mark.